So thanks, Lena, for organizing this conference. No, really. But just, I would say that the richness and breadth of the various papers makes it rather hard for me to have a coherent response. But I really found all of them really fascinating, and they provoked many thoughts, and I think this is actually what good papers should do, and they definitely achieved that. So just apart from my slight minor complaint that it's hard to kind of talk all about all of them, and my apologies that I won't be able to really deal with the depth and details of all of them together, I would just like to draw some general themes and some of the questions that kind of came to my mind as I was reading the papers and as I was listening to David. So I will, since I only had the shorter version, I will only be able again to kind of draw on various things that I now listen to. And kind of, first of all, maybe think a little bit about jurisdiction very abstractly. And as David said, of course, jurisdiction is to say what the law is. But I think that the way we use it more commonly is to actually talk about a sphere of influence or a sphere where your decision making powers take force or take place. And in this sense, jurisdiction is both very clearly territorial, but also has become to represent a more abstract idea of realm of influence, which is not necessarily territorial. And again, I think kind of if we think very abstractly and very theoretically, we would like to think that the jurisdictions should follow and reflect, again, kind of very, very basically, our social, political, mental, and normative realities. So let's think, again, very, very simply, we think we belong to, let's say, a certain city or a certain country, and we would like all institutions to reflect this very simple belonging. But of course, very, very quickly, this simple idea gets complicated. And before we get to the details of the complication, there are two problems. One is that jurisdiction is not merely reflective, but it is also productive. That is, once we create a certain jurisdiction, it also follows that we will adopt a certain identity or a certain belonging or a certain affiliation. And the second, of course, is that we, this kind of simple we, is both fragmented, but it's also multiplied. So we are both fragmented in the sense that we have different and competing affiliations, realities, normativities, social belongings, political belongings, etc. But we are also multiplied. So we exist in several such domains. And again, to kind of imagine a very simple jurisdiction, we would have to go to a very, very simple social and political organization. And it seems that we are only fleeting from that simple reality. And the other thing that I would actually like to emphasize is that it is also impossible to make, let's say that we would have, or we accept the fact that we have these fragmented existences, that we are both, let's say, exist in Tel Aviv, but also in New York. We are both members.
It's true.
It's true. And that we are both members of a certain community, but we are also merchants, so we are also under some kind of a jurisdiction of merchants. The fact, of course, is that these different jurisdictions often collide because there are other, of course, other individuals, but also because we find it very hard to neatly distinguish between these different identifications, affiliations, etc. And there is a fascinating novel that I'm now blanking both of the name of the novel and of the name of the writer, which was written by a law professor, and it is a thought experiment in imagining that we would actually be able to live in the same territorial space, but without acknowledging the existence of other people that share our space, but who live in a different jurisdiction. So let's say that you walk in the street and you actually see a murder taking place. If this murder happens to a person that doesn't belong to your jurisdiction, you are required to strictly ignore that fact. Now, of course, the problem that motivates the novel, and it's a detective novel, is what happens when, let's say, the murder takes place between one person from one jurisdiction and the other from another. And there is a special unit that deals with these conflicts of jurisdiction. Now, why did I bring this thought experiment? Because I think that it is, again, first of all, it brings the two notions of jurisdiction, one of which is territorial, and it insists on our bodily existence, and the fact that we, even though we are now in age of globalization and of virtual reality, etc., we are still extremely corporeal and belong to a certain territorial and also to a certain bodily experience. But at the same time, there are many jurisdictions or many jurisdictional conceptions that are virtual and that do not necessarily involve our corporeal experience. And also, the fact that I think one of the things is that we find this thought experiment, that is to ignore the existence of other jurisdiction, as virtually impossible. So it requires some hardwired or bringing up from very, very early age to actually ignore the various existences of other jurisdictions. So it's not only that we are in a particular jurisdiction, but that we are also heavily interested in what takes place in other jurisdictions. So it's not only when it involves directly us, but it's just the difficulty, for example, to imagine that we completely ignore the murder. Now, this, of course, brings the topic of globalization and of international law as also infringing sovereignty. So now just several questions or two focuses or emphasis that I would like to kind of emphasize in the different presentations that we have heard, and the two kind of big labels are one, power, and the second, theory. So I think that, again, what we constantly kind of heard throughout was that power, in the sense of not just the legal decisions or legal determinations, but also political power makes a significant impact on how we view the relationship between the different overlapping and conflicting jurisdictions. So in David's presentation, it was very overt that I think part of the reason that motivated these fictions, etc., was the imperial power that the British Empire had in deciding that we're actually now going to rule by British law. You can't imagine, or you can imagine, but it were some kind of a very strong imagination, that all the other colonies would be able to make the same fiction, because if they just wanted to judge, let's say, British subjects, they would simply not be able to do that. They would try, and I guess then some kind of a military or an army would actually be sent to prevent that. And of course, the other example, which is the Ottoman Empire, that had to concede for the different European powers to actually give them jurisdiction over their subjects, be it through a mechanism of fiction or non-fiction. You just decide that this is, again, kind of either a territory or that it's a personal law that is applied. And I think, again, also when we think about Google as extremely powerful actor, we can't just think about it in other ways than that it actually exerts so much political power. And in I think Peter's example, also the power of these insurance entities or health funds, of course, is another element that is, of course, also translates into law or into political power in the sense of the more democratically recognized political power, but definitely the power that these kind of groups involve or influences the way that the battle between jurisdictions eventually takes place. Now, it doesn't mean that power overrides the legal structures, but that it is constantly at the background. It also influences the legal structures. Of course, it influences legislation in some elements, but of course, it doesn't necessarily or you can't, if you just think about the legal structures without thinking about external power to the legal frame, I think something there is lacking. The other thing, of course, is how does the legal structure impacts power or powerful parties? And here, again, thinking about using uncertainties or forum shopping or the various other kind of dynamics that follow the overlapping in multiple jurisdictions, often has to be read against the backdrop of powerful, weak parties, etc. And the second point is theory. So, of course, legal pluralism and overlapping jurisdiction is a theoretical concept. It is not just a reality that you have many jurisdictions. It is a theory about how to deal with that and how to conceptualize that. And again, since there are so many issues on the table, I would just kind of pick one of them, which seems to be the most, or one of the most interesting things to think about, which is how and where is the totality of the state or of the superstate to be conceptualized in these overlapping jurisdictions. And I will explain what I mean by that. So I think that, again, as we go chronologically, we see the emergence of the totality of the state as actually encapsulating and including all these various different jurisdictions. So in the Middle Ages, to conceptualize legal pluralism, I think would be very, very different in the sense that it's pre-totality, of course also in the Middle Ages, we could think about other totalities, but definitely with the emergence of the central state and with the empire, there is a political theory that conceptualizes all these jurisdictions as still somehow included within a totality that sees all of them as being part of it, as having some kind of a logic or an idea. It could be a functional idea, more in the discussion of the health funds. In the case, of course, of the British Empire, you have the empire as being the totality of the various entities, and you can even attribute some kind of subjectivity and a clear will that organizes all these things. So you have still the state, maybe the state delegates, it gives some to the private, it gives some to the administration, it gives some to the judiciary, it gives some to all these things. The British decide that the Indians don't have a law, they decide that or Native Americans don't have a law, and the Quebecois do have a law, etc. But I think the more that we move to Ingra's story, there is less and less of a totality that you can attribute a will and a purpose and kind of a plan to what's going on. And then legal pluralism turns from an idea that in which the ingredient parts are, again, parts of that are either functional, maybe they're a bit dysfunctional, but we can follow some kind of a plan, to a place where, again, so some would term it as, again, new medievalism, that is that the different elements do not form a totality. Of course, it would be a historical debate whether there was a totality in the Middle Ages, etc. or not. But at least in our imagination, the totality that we know, which is the totality of the state or the totality of the empire, ceases to exist. And I think here the role of theory is extremely important. That is, how much do we insist as theorists that describe these elements on the importance to still see them as happening, or these different normativities, the different subjectivities, the different citizenships often and affiliations, to still form some kind of a totality, be it the totality of the global, or the totality of the international, or a totality of some kind, maybe of a world government, as some theorists actually insist that we're heading towards, but it is still in the making, it is still in the coming, or whether we're actually willing to decapitate the state in a sense, but in the profound sense of the word, that nothing will emerge, no totality will emerge afterwards. And I think that this kind of description is much more scary, uncertain. We don't know whether it takes place or not. And I think that the various concerns, for example, that Indra has raised, democratic control, right? So this is another manifestation of the idea that democratic control, we still imagine a demos, one demos that can organize somehow through democratic or political organization and control somehow the chaos that is happening there, sometimes more successfully or not, but it requires an idea of a clear demos rather than of 1,000,001 demoses that are completely, and that we're all part of them, right? I mean, that we are actually no longer part of just one demos, but that each of us is a member of many, many demoses, unable to create some kind of a totality. Okay, so I've spoken enough. That's it.